It's definitely in the vein of a Civilization game. I don't know where I was going with that sentence. Where was I going with that sentence? Right. Hey folks, this is Alexander Winn, creator of TerraGenesis. I'm here with another dev diary to talk about what went into making TerraGenesis and some of the decisions that I had to make along the way. This week, I wanted to talk about inspirations. This is a question I get a lot during our Q&As that we do with the fans and that sort of thing, and that is, what inspired me to make TerraGenesis? What led to the creation of this game? So I want to walk through a few video games and movies and books that inspired different aspects of TerraGenesis and see if you can see how they led to different parts of the game. The earliest thing that I can trace back as an early inspiration for TerraGenesis was actually Civilization 2. I grew up as a little kid playing Civilization 2, and I was obsessed with it. I absolutely loved playing Civ 2. And it's an interesting thing, because, you know, the Civilization series is a very popular video game series, but it's very different than a lot of games. In particular, there's no story. It's just a sandbox. It's like a game of Risk, like a game of SimCity. Things happen, but the story is something that you create. Over the course of a game of Civilization, you can have incredibly dramatic occurrences where an ally will betray you and suddenly you're fighting a two-front war, or a breakthrough technology happens and turns the tide of battle, or you lead the discovery of a new continent. All sorts of things happen, but they're organically driven by you. It's not a pre-written story, and every single game of Civilization is different. It'll play out in different ways. And that really set the tone for how a lot of the games that I like work. They're often player-driven. They're not stories. I love stories, and I love games like Mass Effect or Halo that have stories. But there's a special place in my heart for games like Civilization where you create the story. You get to decide what happens, and then everything reacts accordingly. I played Civilization 2 for years. And I moved on to Civilization 3 and 4 and 5, and I continue to play the Civilization series to this day. But really, one game stood out, even more than Civ 2, as a huge influence on me and a huge influence on TerraGenesis, and that is Alpha Centauri. Alpha Centauri was a spin-off of the Civilization franchise. The idea is that Civilization games can end one of several ways. You can conquer the world, you can establish a world government, but one of the ways was to launch a ship toward Alpha Centauri. But they never really go into what happens next. You just win. Hey, they landed on Alpha Centauri, you win, scientific victory, cool. But eventually, they made a whole other game, very similar to Civilization, very much inspired by Civilization, but with quite a few unique mechanics, called Alpha Centauri. And it picked up the baton from Civilization and told you what happened to those people who flew off from Earth. Alpha Centauri is a hugely successful game, and it's even still popular today. And it was a huge inspiration to me for TerraGenesis and for a lot of things that I've made. There are a ton of things that you can look at in Alpha Centauri and see either specific or general influences in TerraGenesis. One of the biggest ones is that in Alpha Centauri, unlike Civilization, where the different factions were based on nationality, in Alpha Centauri, the different factions were based on ideology. The idea was that as the colonists landed on this planet, they split up according to how they think the world should be run. So there's a capitalist faction, and a scientist faction, an environmentalist faction, there's a fascist faction, and a religious faction. There are all of these different factions based on how they think the world should work. And for anybody who's played TerraGenesis, that is obviously a huge inspiration. We have the same thing. We have different factions based on ideology. In fact, a lot of our factions are directly inspired by Alpha Centauri. And of course, some of them are pretty obvious. Having a scientist faction makes sense. Having a religious faction makes sense. In Alpha Centauri, the capitalist faction was known as Morgan Industries. In TerraGenesis, it's known as the Horizon Corporation, but there are others in other franchises. The Ferengi in Star Trek are very much a capitalist faction. So, a lot of these were sort of gimmies. But a few of them were direct inspirations. For example, Gaia's stepdaughters in Alpha Centauri were the direct ancestors of the Daughters of Gaia in TerraGenesis. And they are different in certain ways. They're both environmentally driven, they both have a strong female bent, but there are definitely differences between those two groups. But there's definitely ancestry there. Alpha Centauri is a fantastic game. And again, very similar to Civilization in a lot of ways. You build cities, you build units, you send those units off to fight other factions and conquer territory. You exploit resources, you move up the tech tree. It's definitely in the vein of a Civilization game. But Alpha Centauri introduced one new mechanic that didn't exist in previous games of Civilization, and one that has a definite connection to TerraGenesis, and that is terraforming. Earlier games of Civilization allowed you to do a little bit of changing the map. You could chop down trees and turn them into grassland, you could build roads, that sort of thing. But Alpha Centauri introduced an entirely new unit type called the Former, or Terraformer. And they could literally raise and lower mountains, they could plant forests, they could create rivers, they could create oceans, they could completely reshape the map. And that would have impacts on different aspects of the game. If you changed the biosphere around a certain city, it changed what resources were available to that city. It changed how big a population could fit in that city because there was more or less food. It really became an aspect of gameplay in every way, even military implications. Raising a mountain between you and your enemy would slow them down and maybe provide you with longer range artillery. It was a very interesting aspect of gameplay, and I always wished that you could do more with it. There was a lot that you could do, but you couldn't change the atmosphere in any way or anything like that. And it was cool, but I definitely felt like there was something more that you could do with that. But of course, at the time, I wasn't a game designer. I wanted to be a filmmaker. And Alpha Centauri was fun, but it wasn't something that I was like deconstructing to try to rebuild in a new way. It was cool. And I enjoyed it, and I went on with my life. A few years later in college, I discovered a book series that radically changed the way I think about science and society and humanity's future, and that is the Mars Trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson. This 3-book series, starting with Red Mars, and then Green Mars, and then Blue Mars, starts as the first 100 settlers land on the Red Planet and start building their first city. And then it progresses through hundreds of years of Martian history as different social movements rise and fall, cities are built and ultimately destroyed, and most importantly, the planet is terraformed. This book series goes into incredible detail in the scientific specifics of terraforming. Not just altering the atmosphere, not just warming up the surface, but the specifics of how do you engineer a new biosphere? What kind of genetic alterations are you going to have to make to a species to allow it to survive in the thinner air and the lower gravity? What kind of things are you going to have to build in orbit to support warming up the surface? How long is that stuff going to take? I had never in my life read a book or seen a movie or anything that drew so much drama directly from science. So much of the story was literally just about doing the thing, about figuring out how to terraform the planet, about figuring out what is the right way to terraform the planet, or should we even do it at all? One of the other things that the Mars Trilogy did was it introduced me to an idea that I had never really considered before, and that was that not everybody agrees with terraforming. In the Mars Trilogy, Martian politics is largely divided between two political parties, the Greens, who support terraforming, and the Reds, who have fallen in love with Mars as it exists right now, and don't want to see it become just another Earth. One of the main characters of the story is actually the leader of the Reds, and you see through her eyes how beautiful Mars is, and how it has its own character, and how she doesn't want to see it become just another Earth. Over the course of the trilogy, the Reds are a huge part of the character of Martian culture, and a conversation develops about how much to terraform. Not just should we, but to what degree. You could turn that planet into a jungle, or you could turn it into something more like Arizona, where it still supports life, but it's got a little bit more of that desert character. Like a lot of people, I had never considered the idea that there might be a counter-argument to terraforming, and it was really interesting. I still don't know that I agree with it, but I can certainly see why people would feel that way, and more importantly, I know people who feel that way. And so when I was developing TerraGenesis, I made sure to include a faction that was against terraforming, that based their ideas on preserving the planet. For those who have played TerraGenesis, I am of course talking about the Sons of Hephaestus. That faction had no antecedent in Alpha Centauri or anything else. That was inspired largely by the Mars trilogy and by this idea that not everybody's on the same page. And interestingly, we've gotten messages from players that said, I've always been against the idea of terraforming, and I so love the fact that you included a faction that represented my beliefs. That really has been a hit among the players. A small section, but a passionate one. In fact, my wife and co-founder, Lacey, is actually Hephaestian.
Hephaestians.
Which brings us to the other aspect of the Mars trilogy that was so revolutionary. It dealt with humanity. A lot of science fiction stories, all of the good science fiction stories, draw their strength on the basis of their characters. But oftentimes, societies in these stories are kind of static. You look at the world of the Federation in Star Trek, and it's not that different from modern America. It's a little different. Obviously, they've conquered racism and they've conquered poverty and that sort of thing. But in terms of their values, their accents, their cultural norms, they're all pretty familiar to us. But as anybody who's studied history knows, societies change over time. America is very different right now than it was in 1900, and that was very different from the way it was in 1800. People's values change. People's understanding of how things work changes. And it's an interesting challenge to depict that in fiction. But that is exactly what Kim Stanley Robinson does in the Mars trilogy. You get to watch Martian society develop. They develop their own food, they develop their own slang, they develop their own fashions, all independent of Earth. The culture of Mars develops its own identity over the course of the story, and you get to watch how that happens. What influences it? What does it influence? What decisions get made because of these very specific things that play out in Martian history? I was absolutely blown away. Not only by the science, but also by this incredible humanism, this sense of future history, this sense of people that had not yet been born living out their lives and shaping the course of human history. And I desperately wanted more. I went looking for other books and stories that dealt with this kind of thing. There are a few, but it's surprisingly rare to have that kind of hard sci-fi, really grounded, based in real science, while also dealing with society and history. There's a reason why the Mars trilogy is held up as one of the greatest science fiction stories ever told. Unlike Alpha Centauri, this time I definitely wanted to do something with this. I was still thinking I wanted to be a filmmaker, so I thought I could turn the Mars trilogy into a trilogy of movies or even a TV show on HBO or something like that. There was so much potential there, and you could see so easily this cinematic potential of the Mars trilogy. But I was in film school. Nobody was giving me hundreds of millions of dollars to make a trilogy of films. That was a little out of my realm of expertise. In the meantime, I had been doing more and more development work. I learned how to do web design, and web design became web tool design and web programming. Web programming gave way to app programming. And after a while, I had a decent portfolio of apps. And at a certain point, I started to wonder if maybe I should do something with terraforming. I had been kicking around this idea of something based on terraforming, but I could never quite figure out what it would look like. How do you do, it's such a complex subject. There's a reason that not many people have done it in any kind of depth. Alpha Centauri had still been the game that had gone the deepest into terraforming, and that was, it left a lot out. Most games that dealt with terraforming, it was just like a single item checklist. It was like, hey, you can terraform this planet. It'll take 7 turns. Done. But I had read the Mars trilogy. I knew how much uncertainty went into this and how many different decisions went into it and how many different ethical questions, how many different ways it could go wrong. There was so much there. Why would you simplify it down into just one thing that you do with one click? I mean, come on. But at the same time, that complexity meant that it was hard to figure out what to do with it. To To be perfectly honest, I don't remember how I cracked the code, but ultimately what I settled on was something that I've since come to call Goldilocks gameplay. The idea is that a planet that's too hot is no better than a planet that's too cold. Too much atmospheric pressure is no better than too little atmospheric pressure. Too much oxygen is no better than too little oxygen. You always need it to be in that zone in the middle between the two extremes. And I realized that's gameplay. Keeping different aspects balanced as they influence each other. You know, the thicker the atmosphere it is, the more heat is going to be retained, so it's going to change your surface temperature. The more your surface temperature changes, the more it's going to change your sea level. All these different interlocking systems that you each have to keep in balance. That would be cool gameplay. But for some reason I didn't, do anything with that revelation. I had that idea and I was just like, yeah, I should make that someday. Or somebody should. That'd be cool. Yeah, that's how you would do it. That's the way to do terraforming. Apparently I'm turning into Kermit the Frog. Which brings us to the last thing that inspired TerraGenesis. I was going to a movie, I don't remember which one, but I love movie trailers. I always make sure to get there in time to see the movie trailers. And this time, there was a movie starring Matt Damon called The Martian. And I was blown away. Here was a story based in real science that looked exciting and funny and engaging and everything that I wanted it to be. And it was all real. It was all based in real science. It was science fiction, obviously, but it was all very plausible. And it was about Mars. And I sat there in the theater and I literally thought to myself, you know, if I was smart, I would have my game about terraforming Mars available on the App Store when this movie about landing on Mars comes out. That'd be smart. They had very similar aesthetics. They had a very similar art style. Yeah, I should do that. The problem is, when you're seeing a trailer in a movie theater, that's because the movie's about to come out. The Martian was coming out in a month, and I wanted to have my app made and available by then, so I basically stopped sleeping. I started working really hard on this game. I ended up having a version available by the launch of The Martian, but it wasn't any good. I didn't release it. I went back to the drawing board, worked on it for 10 more months, and released it the following summer. And those are the 4 big inspirations for TerraGenesis: Civilization, Alpha Centauri, the Mars Trilogy, and The Martian. Now I know there may be people watching this thinking, hey, wait a minute, I think you missed one. And that is something that I've gotten asked a lot about since TerraGenesis came out, and the answer is actually, I'd never heard of it. And that's The Expanse. These days, I am a huge Expanse fan. It's very similar to the Mars Trilogy, very similar to The Martian, except with action and geopolitics and war. Very exciting, very cool, lots of hard sci-fi, but still enough to keep it fantastical and awesome. It's a fantastic book series that has been adapted into a great TV show, and I had never heard of it. I don't know how. I was looking for things specifically like that, but yeah, I'd never encountered it. And it wasn't until TerraGenesis came out that people started asking me, hey, were you inspired by The Expanse? Hey, have you seen The Expanse? Hey, have you read The Expanse? And I was like, no. And I checked it out and I was like, this is amazing. So yeah, The Expanse is awesome. And I love The Expanse. And it had nothing to do with TerraGenesis. I wish it had. If I had known about The Expanse before TerraGenesis, maybe I'd added more stuff with spaceships, or, you know, it probably would have influenced the faction design, which is very Alpha Centauri focused, but maybe The Expanse would have shifted it into more of a geopolitical thing with belters and that sort of stuff. It's a fantastic series. You should definitely read it or watch it. It's awesome. Now I know. So that's the deep dive on what inspired TerraGenesis. TerraGenesis has been out for 4.5 years now, which is weird, but awesome. And so obviously since it came out, there have been a lot of things that have gone into making it what it is. There have been other movies and books that have inspired little aspects of it. The Historical Earths campaign was very heavily inspired by a History Channel special called How the Earth Was Made that walks you through the different eras of Earth's history. There have been a lot of things that I've loved and sort of injected into this game, but those 4, Civilization, Alpha Centauri, the Mars Trilogy, and the Martian, that's where you get most of the meat of TerraGenesis. This is the latest in a series of dev diaries that I've been doing about the making of TerraGenesis and what went into it. I'm getting some positive responses, but I definitely want to hear more from people watching this. What would you like me to talk about? Would you like more detail or would you like more breadth? I'm definitely tailoring this to what you want to hear, and I could talk about this stuff all day. So be sure to comment below and let me know what you thought. Let me know what you'd like to hear about more in the future. And in the meantime, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you'll be notified about all our upcoming videos. We've got a lot of awesome stuff going on. We've got Dev Diaries, we've got Slice of Science, we've got the Synthesis, whole bunch of cool stuff. Thanks for watching, and as always, happy terraforming.